Hey friends, tonight you're not charging into battle. You're trapped behind stone walls that reek of human waste and desperation, listening to the sound of enemy hammers building the machines that will slowly kill you. The gates are barred, the grain stores are empty, and outside, 10,000 soldiers settle in for the long wait because they know something you're just beginning to understand. Time is the cruelest weapon ever invented. A medieval siege wasn't about heroic last stands. It was about eating your leather belt, watching children waste away, and discovering what your neighbours taste like when there's nothing left but survival. The truth. Most people broke long before they died. And if you think waiting for your food delivery app is torture, try counting the days until you become someone else's meal. So before we step into that nightmare together, take a moment to hit like and subscribe if these darker truths of history are worth your time. And tell me in the comments, if you were sealed inside those stone walls, what do you think would kill you first? Hunger, disease, or despair? Now dim those lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's exploration together. Because once we begin, there's no escape until the very end. Congratulations. You've just woken up inside the walls of a medieval city under siege. The year is 1347, and outside these stone barriers, an army of 10,000 men has surrounded your home with one simple goal: to wait until you're too weak to fight back. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are about 15,000 other people crammed into a space meant for maybe 8,000, and every single one of them is now competing with you for the same dwindling resources that were supposed to last a few weeks, not the months that stretch ahead like an endless nightmare. Your bed this morning isn't really a bed at all. It's a straw pallet in the corner of a stone building that used to be a grain storehouse, now converted into emergency housing for refugees who fled the countryside when the enemy army appeared on the horizon like a dark cloud. The straw beneath you is damp from the breath and sweat of too many bodies pressed together, and it smells like a barn that's been closed up for winter, which in a way, it has been. There's no privacy here. No personal space, no quiet corner where you can collect your thoughts or pretend, even for a moment, that this isn't happening. You're sharing this cramped space with a blacksmith's family, 2 elderly women whose husbands died in the first skirmish outside the walls, a young mother with 3 children who cry constantly from hunger they don't yet understand, and a merchant who keeps muttering prayers under his breath while clutching a small leather pouch that probably contains the last of his worldly wealth. The smell is a symphony of human misery. Unwashed bodies, stale breath, the sour tang of fear sweat, and underneath it all, the acrid smoke that drifts through every crack and crevice from the cooking fires that burn day and night in the courtyard. There's no escaping it. It clings to your clothes, your hair, your skin, until you can't remember what clean air smells like. You try to stretch, but immediately regret it. Your joints ache from sleeping on stone floors, and your stomach clenches with a hunger that's becoming your constant companion. The single meal you had yesterday, a thin gruel made from barley and hope, feels like a distant memory. Your mouth tastes like copper and desperation. Outside, you can hear the sounds that have become the soundtrack to your new existence. The creak and groan of massive wooden siege engines being assembled just beyond arrow range. The rhythmic hammering of carpenters building towers that will soon loom over your walls. The distant shouts of enemy soldiers, their voices carrying on the wind like threats whispered in your ear. And then, cutting through it all, the sound that makes your blood freeze. The deep, resonant thrum of a trebuchet releasing its payload. You count the seconds, 1, 2, 3, and then the crash as a stone the size of a wine barrel smashes into the outer wall, sending vibrations through the ground beneath your feet. Welcome to your new reality. This is day one of what might be your final months on Earth. The siege has begun, and there's no going back. The morning light filters through the narrow window slits, casting long shadows across the crowded floor where dozens of people are beginning to stir. Children whimper for food that isn't there. Adults exchange worried glances that say everything words cannot. And somewhere in the distance, you can hear the city's bells ringing not in celebration, but in warning. This is how a medieval siege begins. Not with a bang, but with the slow, inexorable tightening of a noose around an entire city's throat. And you, whether you realize it or not, are about to discover just how far human beings will go to survive when civilization itself begins to crumble around them. The siege engines outside aren't just weapons. They're instruments of psychological torture designed to break your spirit long before they break your walls. Every crash, every tremor, every distant shout is a reminder that you're trapped, that help isn't coming, and that the only way out is through surrender, starvation, or death. So take a deep breath of that smoky, fear-tinged air. Stretch those aching limbs one more time, because from this moment forward, every single day will be a battle not against enemy soldiers, but against time, hunger, disease, and the gradual dissolution of everything you thought you knew about human nature. Your siege has begun, and it's going to get much, much worse. The first day, when hope still lived, you stumble to your feet, joints protesting like rusty hinges, and make your way toward the narrow window that serves as your only connection to the outside world. What you see there will haunt you for however many days you have left. The enemy camp stretches to the horizon like a second city, a sprawling maze of tents, cooking fires, and siege works that seems to go on forever. Thousands of men move about their morning routines with the casual confidence of people who know they hold all the cards. They're in no hurry. They have time, supplies, and most importantly, they have options. You have none of these things. But here's the thing about the first day of a siege. Hope is a stubborn beast. Despite the evidence of your eyes, despite the rumbling in your stomach, despite the fear that sits in your chest like a cold stone, you still believe this will be over soon. Relief is coming. The king's army is marching. Your lord's allies will arrive any day now with enough soldiers to scatter these besiegers like leaves in the wind. This optimism isn't stupidity, it's survival. Because if you truly understood on that first morning exactly what lay ahead, you might just walk to the gates and surrender yourself to whatever mercy the enemy might offer. Which, historically speaking, isn't much. The city's leadership is doing everything they can to maintain this illusion of temporary inconvenience. The mayor, a portly man whose own belt has already been tightened a notch, stands in the main square, addressing the crowd with the kind of forced cheerfulness usually reserved for funeral eulogies. "Citizens," he declares, his voice echoing off the stone buildings. "We face a temporary challenge. Our walls are strong, our resolve stronger. The enemy thinks to starve us into submission, but they underestimate both our supplies and our spirit. Relief will come. Until then, we must simply endure." Endure. Such a small word for such an enormous task. The crowd murmurs its approval, but you can see the doubt in their eyes. These are people who know how much food was in the granaries before the siege began. They know how many mouths need feeding. They can do the mathematics of survival, and the numbers don't look promising. But still, hope persists. Maybe the estimates are wrong. Maybe relief will come sooner than expected. Maybe the enemy will grow bored and move on to easier targets. Maybe, maybe, maybe. The first rationing measures are announced with the same forced optimism. 2 meals a day instead of 3. Smaller portions, but nothing drastic. Just temporary measures until the situation resolves itself. The city's bakers are instructed to stretch the flour with whatever they can find. Sawdust, ground acorns, anything that might fill a stomach and provide the illusion of sustenance. Your own breakfast consists of a bowl of thin porridge that tastes like disappointment and a chunk of bread so hard you could use it as a weapon. The porridge is mostly water with a few grains of barley floating in it like survivors from a shipwreck. The bread requires serious negotiation with your teeth, and even then, you're not entirely sure you're winning. But you eat it gratefully because you don't yet understand that this meager meal represents abundance compared to what's coming. The social dynamics of the siege are already beginning to shift in ways that will become increasingly important as the weeks drag on. The wealthy merchants and nobles have retreated to the better quarters near the castle keep, where they've stockpiled private supplies and hired guards to protect them. They speak in hushed tones about their contingency plans, their secret caches of food, their connections to people who might be able to negotiate safe passage when things get truly desperate. The poor, meanwhile, are crammed into every available space like cargo in a ship's hold. Families who once had their own homes now share single rooms with strangers. Privacy becomes a luxury no one can afford. Personal space shrinks to whatever you can defend with your elbows. And you, caught somewhere in the middle of this social hierarchy, begin to understand that your survival will depend not just on the city's ability to withstand the siege, but on your ability to navigate the increasingly complex web of relationships, alliances, and competitions that will determine who eats and who doesn't. The children don't understand yet. They play their games in the narrow alleys between buildings, their laughter echoing off stone walls like ghosts of better times. They chase each other through crowds of worried adults, oblivious to the tension that hangs in the air like smoke. Their parents watch them with expressions that mix love and terror in equal measure, knowing that childhood innocence is about to become another casualty of war. By midday, the first stones begin to fall. The trebuchets outside the walls have been loaded and aimed, and now they begin their methodical work of destruction. Each stone weighs as much as a grown man and travels with enough force to punch through solid masonry like it's made of cheese. The sound they make when they hit is indescribable, a combination of thunder, earthquake, and the world ending all at once. The first stone smashes into a watchtower on the eastern wall, sending chunks of masonry flying like deadly rain. The second crashes into a residential building, collapsing half the roof and sending a family scrambling into the street with whatever possessions they can carry. The third lands in the market square, creating a crater where yesterday there was a fountain. And with each impact, your hope dies a little more, because now you understand that this isn't going to be a quick resolution. The enemy isn't bluffing or posturing. They're here to stay, and they're going to systematically destroy your city one stone at a time until you either surrender or die. The psychological impact of the bombardment is almost worse than the physical damage. Every crash makes you flinch. Every moment of silence makes you tense, waiting for the next impact. Sleep becomes impossible. Concentration becomes a luxury. Your world shrinks to the space between one stone's impact and the next. And still, somehow, hope clings to life like a weed growing through cracked stone. Maybe the walls will hold. Maybe the enemy will run out of stones. Maybe their siege engines will break down. Maybe relief will come tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. Maybe you'll survive this after all. But as night falls on your first day under siege, as you lie down on your straw pallet surrounded by the sounds of other people's nightmares, You can't shake the feeling that you're living through the last normal day of your life. Tomorrow will be worse, and the day after that will be worse still. The siege has only just begun, and already you can feel the city beginning to change around you. The smiles are more forced, the conversations more hushed, the portions smaller, the fear more palpable, and somewhere in the back of your mind, a small voice whispers the question you're not yet ready to ask. What will you do when hope finally dies? Week 1. When reality comes knocking. 7 days have passed since the siege began, and you're starting to understand that this isn't a temporary inconvenience. It's your new way of life, and that life is about to become significantly more complicated. The enemy has been busy during this first week. What started as a collection of tents and campfires has transformed into a sophisticated siege operation that would impress a military engineer. Massive wooden towers now loom over the landscape like mechanical giants, their platforms bristling with archers and crossbowmen who can shoot down into your city with impunity. The trebuchets have been joined by mangonels and catapults, creating a battery of destruction that operates with the regularity of a church bell, marking time with crashes and screams. But it's not just the siege engines that have evolved. The enemy has built a complete infrastructure of conquest. Supply wagons arrive daily, bringing fresh food, weapons, and reinforcements. They've dug latrines, established hospitals, even set up what appears to be a marketplace where soldiers can trade for luxuries. They're not camping outside your walls. They're living there, and they clearly intend to stay as long as it takes. Meanwhile, inside the city, the illusion of normalcy is beginning to crack like old paint. The rationing has become more severe. What started as 2 meals a day has become 1 meal and a snack, and both portions have shrunk to sizes that would have been considered insulting a week ago. The bread now contains more sawdust than flour, giving it a texture that's somewhere between food and building material. The porridge has become so thin you can see your reflection in it, and that reflection looks increasingly gaunt as the days pass. Your stomach has become a constant companion, growling and cramping with a persistence that makes concentration nearly impossible. You find yourself thinking about food during conversations, dreaming about meals you've eaten in the past, fantasizing about feasts that exist only in your imagination. The simple act of chewing has become a luxury to be savored, each bite stretched out as long as possible to maximize the illusion of satisfaction. But hunger isn't the only enemy you're facing. The overcrowding that seemed manageable on day 1 has become a nightmare of human logistics. The building where you sleep now houses twice as many people as it did when the siege began, as families from the outer districts have been forced to abandon their homes to the bombardment. Privacy has become a memory. Personal space has shrunk to whatever you can defend with your body. The smell has evolved too, from merely unpleasant to actively hostile. Unwashed bodies, inadequate sanitation, cooking fires that burn whatever fuel can be found, and the underlying tang of fear sweat that seems to permeate everything. You've stopped noticing it consciously, but it follows you everywhere like an invisible cloud of despair. Sleep has become a competitive sport. The stone floors are hard enough to bruise bones, and the constant noise makes rest nearly impossible. During the day, there's the regular percussion of siege engines and the crash of falling masonry. At night, there are the sounds of too many people trying to find comfort where none exists. Crying children, worried conversations, the rustle of bodies shifting position in search of relief that never comes. And then there are the nightmares. When you do manage to fall asleep, your dreams are filled with falling stones, burning buildings, and endless corridors that lead nowhere. You wake up more tired than when you went to sleep, your body aching and your mind foggy with exhaustion. The social fabric of the city is beginning to fray in ways that would have been unthinkable a week ago. Neighbours who once shared meals now eye each other suspiciously, wondering who might be hoarding food. Children who once played together now compete for scraps like feral animals. Adults who once exchanged pleasantries now communicate in grunts and suspicious glances. The wealthy are becoming more obvious about their advantages. They eat better, sleep in more comfortable quarters, and seem somehow cleaner and less desperate than everyone else. Their children don't cry from hunger. Their clothes don't reek of smoke and desperation. They move through the city like they're visiting a foreign country, observing the suffering of others with the detached interest of tourists. This inequality breeds resentment that grows stronger each day. Whispered conversations in dark corners speculate about private food stores, secret deals with the enemy, plans for escape that don't include the common people. The social contract that holds a community together is beginning to dissolve under the pressure of survival. You find yourself changing too, in ways that would have horrified your past self. You catch yourself calculating the food value of everything you see. You estimate how many meals could be made from a neighbour's hidden supplies. You wonder what would happen if certain people simply disappeared, freeing up their rations for others. These thoughts come unbidden and leave you feeling ashamed, but they keep coming anyway. The city's leadership is struggling to maintain order and morale. The mayor's daily speeches have become increasingly desperate, filled with promises that sound less convincing each time they're repeated. Relief is coming. The enemy will grow tired and leave. The walls will hold. The supplies will last. But his own appearance betrays the lie. He's lost weight too, and his clothes hang loose on a frame that's shrinking daily. The guards who once maintained order with authority and respect now rely increasingly on force and intimidation. They're hungry too, and their patience for civil disobedience has evaporated along with their body fat. Disputes that once would have been settled with words now end with clubs and arrests. The rule of law is being replaced by the law of survival, and through it all, the bombardment continues with mechanical precision. The enemy has settled into a routine that's almost worse than random attacks. Every morning at dawn, the first stones begin to fall. They continue throughout the day at irregular intervals, just often enough to keep everyone on edge, just random enough to make prediction impossible. By evening, the count of damaged buildings has grown, the list of casualties has lengthened, and the city has become a little smaller, a little more desperate, a little closer to collapse. The walls themselves are beginning to show the strain. What started as minor chips and cracks has evolved into serious structural damage. Entire sections of masonry have been reduced to rubble, hastily repaired with whatever materials can be found. The repairs are obvious, ugly patches that serve as constant reminders of the city's vulnerability. But perhaps the most disturbing change is in the people themselves. The faces that greeted the siege with determination and hope now show the hollow-eyed look of chronic hunger. Conversations that once ranged over politics, weather, and local gossip now focus exclusively on food, safety, and survival. Laughter has become rare, and when it does occur, it has a hysterical edge that suggests minds beginning to crack under pressure. Children are particularly affected. They don't understand why their parents can't provide the food and security they once took for granted. They don't comprehend why their world has suddenly become so small, so dangerous, so filled with adult anxiety. They adapt with the resilience of youth, but that adaptation comes at a cost. They're learning lessons about human nature and survival that no child should have to learn. As you lie down on your straw pallet at the end of this first week, surrounded by the sounds of other people's misery, you realize that the person who woke up 7 days ago no longer exists. That person had hope, optimism, faith in the basic goodness of human nature and the reliability of social institutions. That person believed that problems had solutions, that help would come, that civilization was stronger than chaos. You are someone else now. Someone harder, hungrier, more desperate. Someone who understands that survival is not guaranteed, that help is not coming, and that the only person you can truly count on is yourself. The siege has only just begun, but already it has changed you in ways you're only beginning to understand. And tomorrow, it will change you more. Month 1. When hunger becomes your master. 30 days have passed since the siege began, and you've discovered that the human body is both more resilient and more fragile than you ever imagined. You can survive on far less food than you thought possible, but the cost of that survival is measured in more than just weight loss. Your reflection in the few remaining mirrors shows a stranger's face. Your cheeks have hollowed out, creating shadows where once there was flesh. Your eyes seem larger, more prominent, with a brightness that speaks of fever and desperation rather than health. Your clothes hang loose on a frame that's shrinking daily, and you've had to punch new holes in your belt to keep your pants from falling down. But the physical changes are nothing compared to what's happening in your mind. Food has become an obsession that colours every thought, every conversation, every moment of your waking life. You dream about meals you've eaten years ago, remembering them with the clarity of religious visions. A piece of bread from your childhood becomes a sacred memory. A bowl of stew shared with friends transforms into a paradise lost. You find yourself staring at other people's mouths when they eat, watching every chew with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts. The city's food situation has moved from concerning to catastrophic. The official rations have been cut again, and what passes for a meal would have been considered animal feed a month ago. The bread is now more sawdust and ground acorns than actual grain, with a texture that requires serious jaw work and a taste that suggests the bakers have given up any pretense of creating something edible. The porridge has become a thin gruel that provides the illusion of warmth, but little else. But here's where things get interesting, in the way that disasters are always interesting to those not experiencing them. People have begun to get creative with their food sources. Rats, once considered vermin to be eliminated, have become a delicacy. The city's cats have largely disappeared, not because they've fled, but because they've been quietly added to cooking pots when no one was looking. Dogs that once played with children now eye their former playmates with mutual suspicion, each species recognizing the other as potential sustenance. The leather industry has taken on new meaning. Belts, shoes, and saddles are being boiled into a gelatinous soup that provides some nutrition and the psychological comfort of having something to chew. The taste is indescribable, somewhere between old boots and regret, but it fills the stomach and provides the illusion of having eaten a meal. Tree bark has become a staple ingredient. The city's few remaining trees are being systematically stripped of their bark, which is then ground into flour and added to whatever passes for bread. It provides bulk and fibre, though it also provides stomach cramps and digestive issues that add another layer of misery to daily life. Even grass and weeds have found their way into cooking pots. The city's few green spaces have been picked clean by desperate foragers who gather anything that might be remotely edible. Dandelions, clover, even tree leaves are being boiled into bitter soups that provide minimal nutrition but maximum desperation. The social dynamics have evolved in predictable and disturbing ways. A black market has emerged where food is traded for valuables, services, and increasingly information. A handful of grain might cost a silver coin. A piece of actual meat could bankrupt a family. The wealthy, who stockpiled supplies before the siege, now control an underground economy where survival is the only currency that matters. Theft has become commonplace. Food disappears from cooking pots when backs are turned. Personal supplies vanish from hiding places that once seemed secure. Trust, already strained, has largely evaporated. People sleep with their meagre possessions clutched to their chests, and even then, they sometimes wake to find their rations gone. Violence over food has escalated from arguments to actual fights. You've witnessed grown men come to blows over a mouldy piece of bread. You've seen women scratch and claw at each other for the right to scrape the bottom of an empty pot. Children have learned to eat quickly and hide their food, understanding instinctively that showing weakness or abundance can be dangerous. The city's sanitation system, never robust to begin with, has completely collapsed under the pressure of overcrowding and malnutrition. Human waste accumulates in corners and alleys, creating breeding grounds for disease that spread through the population like wildfire. Dysentery has become so common that it's considered normal. Typhus and cholera lurk in the contaminated water supply, waiting to claim victims already weakened by starvation. The smell of the city has evolved into something that defies description. It's a combination of unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food scraps, smoke from fires that burn anything combustible, and the sweet, sick odour of people dying slowly from hunger and disease. It clings to everything and everyone, a constant reminder of how far civilization has fallen. Medical care has become a luxury that few can afford. The city's physicians are overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients, and their supplies of medicines and treatments have long since been exhausted. Broken bones go unset, infections go untreated. Diseases that would have been minor inconveniences in peacetime become death sentences in the siege. Children are dying first, their small bodies unable to cope with the combination of malnutrition and disease. Their deaths are mourned briefly and then forgotten, because grief is a luxury that requires energy no one can spare. The elderly follow close behind, their weakened immune systems no match for the harsh conditions. But perhaps the most disturbing development is how quickly these deaths have become normalized. Bodies are removed from buildings with the same casual efficiency once reserved for taking out garbage. Burial has become a simplified process, with mass graves replacing individual ceremonies. The dead are mourned for moments rather than days, because the living have their own survival to worry about. The psychological toll is becoming as visible as the physical one. People move through the city like sleepwalkers, their eyes focused on nothing, their expressions blank with exhaustion and despair. Conversations have dwindled to essential communications about food, safety, and immediate survival. The social pleasantries that once made life bearable have been discarded as unnecessary luxuries. Mental illness is spreading as quickly as physical disease. Some people retreat into catatonic states, sitting motionless for hours while staring at nothing. Others become manic, talking rapidly about escape plans that make no sense or relief armies that exist only in their imagination. A few become violent, lashing out at anyone who comes too close to their dwindling resources. The city's leadership has largely given up any pretense of maintaining morale. The mayor's daily speeches have become brief, factual reports about rations and casualties. There are no more promises of relief, no more assurances that the situation will improve. The truth is too obvious to deny. They are all slowly dying, and everyone knows it. Religious faith, once a source of comfort, has become complicated. Some people pray more fervently than ever, believing that divine intervention is their only hope. Others have abandoned faith entirely, unable to reconcile their suffering with the idea of a benevolent deity. The city's priests struggle to provide comfort while dealing with their own hunger and despair. And through it all, the bombardment continues with mechanical precision. The enemy has settled into a routine that maximizes psychological impact while conserving ammunition. They know that time is on their side, that hunger and disease are doing their work more effectively than any weapon. The stones that fall now are almost incidental, serving mainly to remind the defenders that escape is impossible and surrender is the only rational choice. But surrender isn't really an option either. Everyone knows what happens to cities that resist siege for too long. The enemy army has invested too much time and resources in this operation to show mercy. When the walls finally fall, the massacre will be thorough and brutal. Surrender might mean a quicker death, but it still means death for most of the population. So you continue to survive day by day, meal by meager meal, clinging to life with a desperation that would have been unimaginable a month ago. You've learned to find sustenance in things that once would have disgusted you. You've learned to sleep despite hunger pangs that feel like knives in your stomach. You've learned to ignore the suffering of others because acknowledging it would make your own situation unbearable. You've become someone you don't recognize, someone harder and more ruthless than the person who entered this siege. And the worst part is, you know this is only the beginning. The real test of your humanity is still to come. Month 2. When desperation becomes your religion, 60 days into the siege, and you've crossed a threshold you didn't know existed. The person you were before this began feels like a character from a story you once heard. Someone whose problems were so trivial they barely qualified as inconveniences. That person worried about comfort, pleasure, social status. You worry about whether you'll live to see tomorrow. Your body has become a stranger to you. The weight loss has accelerated beyond what seems physically possible. Your ribs are visible through your skin like the frame of a half-built house. Your hip bones jut out at angles that make lying down painful. Your face has taken on the gaunt, hollow-eyed appearance of a death mask, and when you catch glimpses of yourself in reflective surfaces, you sometimes don't recognize the creature staring back. But the physical changes are nothing compared to what's happening in your mind. Hunger has evolved from a sensation to a constant companion, a voice that whispers in your ear during every waking moment. It colors every thought, influences every decision, shapes every interaction with other people. You find yourself calculating the caloric value of everything you see, including things that were never meant to be food. The city's water situation has become as critical as the food shortage. The wells that once provided clean, abundant water are running low, and what remains has become contaminated with human waste, dead animals, and the general filth that accumulates when too many people are crammed into too small a space. The water tastes of desperation and disease, but you drink it anyway because the alternative is death by thirst, which comes much faster than death by starvation. Dysentery has become so common that it's considered a normal part of daily life. Everyone has it to some degree, and the constant cramping and diarrhea add another layer of misery to an already unbearable situation. The city's few remaining latrines overflow constantly, creating rivers of human waste that flow through the streets like a parody of the clean streams that once supplied the city. The enemy has introduced a new form of psychological warfare that's more effective than any siege engine. They've begun using their catapults to launch more than just stones. Dead animals, human waste, And most horrifyingly, the severed heads of captured defenders now rain down from the sky like a grotesque parody of divine judgment. The message is clear. This is what awaits you all. But perhaps the most disturbing projectiles are the ones that arrive with notes attached. Messages from the outside world, letters from family members who have been captured or killed, reports of other cities that have fallen to the same army. The psychological impact is devastating. Hope, already weakened by hunger and disease, takes another beating with each message that confirms the defenders' worst fears. The social structure of the city has completely collapsed. The wealthy, who once maintained the pretense of noblesse oblige, now openly hoard their resources and hire guards to protect them from the increasingly desperate masses. They eat better, sleep in cleaner quarters, and seem somehow immune to the diseases that ravage everyone else. Their children still have flesh on their bones, while other children waste away to nothing. This inequality has bred a resentment that goes beyond mere envy. Whispered conversations in dark corners speak of revolution, of taking by force what the wealthy refuse to share. Some of these conversations have moved beyond whispers to action. There have been raids on the houses of the rich, violent confrontations over hoarded supplies, and at least one case of a wealthy merchant being beaten to death by a mob that discovered his hidden food stores. The city's guards, once the enforcers of law and order, have become just another faction competing for resources. They use their weapons and authority to secure better rations for themselves and their families, and they've largely abandoned any pretense of protecting the general population. Justice has become a luxury that no one can afford, but it's the children who represent the most heartbreaking aspect of this ongoing catastrophe. They're dying in numbers that would have been unthinkable 2 months ago, their small bodies simply unable to cope with the combination of malnutrition, disease, and exposure. They die quietly, without drama, simply fading away like candles running out of wax. The survivors among the children have adapted in ways that are both remarkable and disturbing. They've learned to scavenge with the efficiency of professional thieves. They've learned to hide food and eat in secret. They've learned to recognize the signs of death in adults and to stay away from the dying because death might be contagious. They've learned lessons about human nature that no child should ever have to learn. And then there are the rumors. They start as whispers in the darkest corners of the city, spoken in voices so low they're barely audible. Stories about people who have crossed the final line, who have abandoned the last pretense of civilization in favor of survival at any cost. Stories about meat that doesn't come from animals, about cooking pots that contain ingredients no one wants to identify, about families that have grown smaller not because members have died of disease, but because they've been consumed by the survivors. At first, these stories are dismissed as hysteria, as the fevered imaginings of minds cracked by hunger and despair. But as the days pass and the stories multiply, they become harder to ignore. People begin to eye each other with a new kind of suspicion, wondering who might be capable of crossing that ultimate taboo. The first confirmed case comes as a shock even to people who thought they were beyond being shocked. A family in the Eastern Quarter is discovered with human remains in their cooking pot. The meat has been carefully prepared, seasoned, and cooked like any other meal. When confronted, they don't deny what they've done. They simply stare with the blank eyes of people who have moved beyond shame, beyond guilt, beyond any emotion except the desperate need to survive. The discovery sends ripples of horror through the remaining population, but the horror is complicated by understanding. Everyone is hungry. Everyone is desperate. Everyone has wondered, in their darkest moments, what they would do if faced with the choice between death and the unthinkable. The city's leadership tries to maintain some semblance of moral authority by condemning the act and punishing the perpetrators, but their condemnation rings hollow. They're hungry too, they're desperate too. And everyone knows that if the siege continues much longer, this won't be an isolated incident. The enemy outside the walls seems to understand the psychological impact of this development. They've begun catapulting leaflets into the city, messages that describe the abundant food in their camp, the warm beds, the medical care available to anyone who surrenders. The contrast with conditions inside the city couldn't be more stark. But surrender isn't really an option. Everyone knows what happens to cities that resist for too long. The enemy army has invested months in this siege, lost soldiers to disease and skirmishes, spent enormous resources on the operation. When they finally break through, their revenge will be thorough and brutal. Surrender might mean a quicker death, but it still means death. So the siege continues, and with each passing day, the line between civilization and savagery becomes thinner. People who once would have died rather than compromise their principles now find themselves capable of acts they never would have imagined. The social contract that holds communities together has been dissolved by hunger, replaced by the simple arithmetic of survival. Fire has become another enemy. The enemy's incendiary weapons, including the terrifying Greek fire that burns even on water, have begun to take their toll on the city's buildings. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to ash and rubble, forcing their residents to crowd into the remaining structures. The smoke from these fires adds another layer to the city's toxic atmosphere, making breathing difficult and adding a constant haze that blocks out the sun. The psychological impact of the fires is almost worse than the physical damage. There's something primal about the fear of fire, something that reaches deep into the human psyche and triggers panic responses that are difficult to control. People who have endured months of bombardment with stoic resignation break down completely when they see flames approaching their homes. Sleep has become almost impossible. The combination of hunger, disease, overcrowding, and constant fear has created a population of walking zombies who exist in a state somewhere between waking and sleeping. Hallucinations are common, brought on by malnutrition and exhaustion. People see things that aren't there, hear voices that don't exist, have conversations with family members who died weeks ago. And through it all, the bombardment continues with mechanical precision. The enemy has perfected their routine, maximizing psychological impact while conserving resources. They know that time is on their side, that hunger and disease are more effective than any weapon they could deploy. As you lie down on your straw pallet at the end of another day in hell, surrounded by the sounds of people dying slowly, you realize that you've become something you never thought possible, a survivor at any cost. The moral certainties that once guided your life have been stripped away by necessity, replaced by the simple imperative to live another day. Tomorrow will be worse, and the day after that will be worse still. But you'll face them anyway, because the alternative is to give up, and giving up means death. And despite everything you've seen, everything you've done, everything you've become, you're not ready to die yet. The siege has changed you in ways that can never be undone, but it hasn't killed you. Not yet. Month 3. When humanity breaks. 90 days. 3 months. A season of hell that has transformed you into something that barely qualifies as human anymore. If someone from your old life could see you now, they wouldn't recognize the creature you've become. Your body has consumed itself from the inside out, leaving behind a skeleton wrapped in loose skin that hangs like ill-fitting clothes on a scarecrow. Your face has become a skull with eyes, your cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, your temples hollow caves that cast shadows in even the dimmest light. Your hands shake constantly now, not from fear, but from the simple effort of keeping your body functioning on the edge of starvation. Your voice, when you use it, sounds like wind through broken glass, but the physical deterioration is nothing compared to what's happened to your mind. Hunger has evolved beyond sensation, beyond obsession, into something approaching religious experience. You think about food with the intensity that monks reserve for divine contemplation. Every scrap, every crumb, every possibility of sustenance occupies your thoughts with the single-minded focus of a predator stalking prey. The city around you has become a necropolis populated by the walking dead. Bodies lie in the streets where they fell, too numerous to bury and too dangerous to move because of the diseases they carry. The living step over them with the casual indifference of people navigating familiar furniture. Death has become so common that it's lost its power to shock or sadden. It's simply another fact of daily existence, like sunrise or rain. The water situation has moved beyond critical to catastrophic. The few remaining wells produce liquid that's more sewage than water, thick with contamination and teeming with the kind of microscopic life that kills rather than sustains. People drink it anyway because the alternative is death by thirst, which comes faster than death by disease. The taste is indescribable, a combination of human waste, rotting flesh, and despair that coats your mouth and throat like liquid misery. Disease has become the city's primary industry. Typhus, cholera, dysentery, and plague move through the population like competing merchants, each claiming their share of customers. The symptoms have become so familiar that people diagnose themselves and others with the casual expertise of physicians. Fever, delirium, bloody stools, and the characteristic swellings of plague are discussed with the same matter-of-fact tone once reserved for weather. Medical care has ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The city's physicians are either dead or too sick to practice, and their supplies of medicines were exhausted months ago. Treatment consists of prayer, hope, and the kind of folk remedies that desperate people invent when real medicine isn't available. Most patients simply lie where they fall until they either recover or die, and recovery has become increasingly rare. But it's the social breakdown that represents the most complete transformation of human civilization. The pretense of law, order, and moral behavior has been abandoned entirely. Theft is no longer a crime, it's a survival strategy. Violence is no longer aberrant, it's a tool for resource acquisition. Murder is no longer shocking, it's sometimes necessary. The wealthy, who once maintained their superiority through social position and accumulated resources, now survive through hired violence and fortified positions. They've retreated to the strongest buildings in the city centre, surrounded themselves with armed guards, and created a miniature fortress within the larger fortress. They still eat better than everyone else, but their advantage has narrowed considerably. Even they are beginning to show the effects of prolonged siege. The guards who protect them are no longer motivated by duty or loyalty, but by the promise of better rations and safer sleeping quarters. They've become mercenaries in the truest sense, selling their services to whoever can offer the best terms for survival. Their allegiance lasts exactly as long as their employers can feed them. And then there's the cannibalism. What began as isolated incidents has evolved into something approaching normalcy. The taboo that once made the consumption of human flesh unthinkable has been eroded by necessity until it's become just another survival strategy. Families that lose members to disease or starvation don't waste the meat. Bodies that once would have been buried with ceremony are now viewed as resources to be utilized. The process has become systematized in ways that would be horrifying if they weren't so practical. Bodies are butchered with the same techniques used for livestock. The meat is prepared, seasoned, and cooked like any other protein. Recipes have been developed, preferences established, techniques refined. What was once the ultimate taboo has become a culinary specialty born of desperation. The psychological impact of this development varies from person to person. Some people approach it with the grim pragmatism of survivors who have moved beyond moral considerations. Others maintain elaborate mental justifications, convincing themselves that they're honoring the dead by ensuring their sacrifice contributes to the survival of the living. A few have simply broken under the psychological pressure and exist in a state of constant mental anguish. But perhaps most disturbing are those who have adapted completely, who discuss the relative merits of different cuts of human meat with the same casual expertise once reserved for beef or pork. They've moved beyond horror, beyond guilt, beyond any emotional response except the practical consideration of nutrition and survival. Children have largely disappeared from the city, not because they've been evacuated, but because they've been consumed. Their smaller bodies succumb to starvation and disease more quickly than adults, and their meat is considered more tender and palatable. The few surviving children have learned to hide, to avoid adults, to recognize the look in people's eyes that suggests they're being evaluated as potential meals rather than fellow human beings. The enemy outside the walls has begun to take notice of these developments. Their spies and informants report back about the conditions inside the city, and the reports have apparently convinced them that victory is imminent. The bombardment has actually decreased in recent weeks, not because they've grown merciful, but because they understand that hunger and disease are doing their work more efficiently than any weapon. They've begun to send negotiators under flags of truce, offering terms for surrender that become more generous as the city's condition deteriorates. They're no longer demanding unconditional surrender. They're offering safe passage for civilians, medical care for the sick, and food for the starving. The terms are almost certainly lies, but they're attractive lies to people who have nothing left to lose. The city's leadership has begun to fracture under the pressure. The mayor, once a figure of authority and stability, has become a hollow-eyed scarecrow who speaks in whispers and jumps at shadows. His daily addresses to the population have become incoherent rambles about divine judgment, historical precedent, and the nobility of suffering. He's clearly lost his grip on reality, but there's no one left with the authority or energy to replace him. The military commanders who once planned the city's defense have either died or abandoned their posts. The few remaining soldiers are too weak to fight and too hungry to care about military discipline. They've become just another group of desperate survivors competing for resources, their weapons and training giving them only a slight advantage in the struggle for survival. Fire has become an almost daily occurrence. The enemy's incendiary weapons have ignited buildings throughout the city, and the fires spread unchecked because there's no organized effort to fight them. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to ash and rubble, their former residents either dead or crowded into the remaining structures. The smoke from these fires has created a permanent haze that blocks out the sun and makes breathing difficult. The psychological impact of living in a burning city is profound. Fire represents destruction in its purest form, and the constant threat of immolation adds another layer of terror to an already unbearable situation. People who have endured months of starvation and disease with stoic resignation break down completely when they see flames approaching their shelters. Sleep has become impossible for most people. The combination of hunger, disease, overcrowding, fear, and the constant threat of fire has created a population of insomniacs who exist in a twilight state between waking and sleeping. Hallucinations are common, brought on by malnutrition, exhaustion, and the psychological trauma of prolonged siege. The hallucinations often involve food, elaborate feasts that exist only in the minds of the starving. People have conversations with imaginary meals, negotiate with phantom banquets, and wake up from dreams of abundance to the reality of empty stomachs and empty cooking pots. These food hallucinations are so vivid and compelling that some people prefer them to reality, retreating into fantasy worlds where hunger doesn't exist. And through it all, the siege engines continue their methodical work of destruction. The trebuchets and catapults operate with the regularity of clockwork, marking time with crashes and screams. But their psychological impact has diminished as people have become numb to everything except the immediate requirements of survival. The sound of falling stones has become background noise, no more significant than wind or rain. The walls themselves are beginning to fail in critical places. Months of bombardment have created gaps and weaknesses that the defenders lack the strength and resources to repair properly. Everyone knows that when the enemy decides to launch their final assault, the walls will not hold. The only question is whether anyone inside the city will still be alive to witness the end. As you lie down on your straw pallet at the end of another day in this man-made hell, you realize that you've become something that your former self would have considered a monster. You've eaten things that were never meant to be food. You've done things that were never meant to be done. You've survived by abandoning every moral principle that once defined your humanity. But you're still alive, against all odds. Despite everything you've endured, despite everything you've become, you're still breathing. And tomorrow, you'll wake up and continue the grim business of survival because the alternative is to give up, and giving up means death. The siege has broken you in ways that can never be repaired, but it hasn't killed you, not yet. The end, when the walls finally fall, day 107. The number has lost all meaning except as a marker of how long human beings can endure the unendurable. You've survived longer than seemed possible, but survival has come at a cost that can never be calculated or repaid. You are no longer the person who entered this siege. You are something else entirely, something forged in the crucible of desperation and tempered by the hammer of necessity. The end, when it comes, arrives not with the dramatic flourish of Hollywood battles, but with the quiet inevitability of a natural disaster. The walls, weakened by months of bombardment and neglected maintenance, finally develop cracks too large to ignore. What started as hairline fractures has evolved into gaps wide enough for a man to walk through. The defenders, too weak to fight and too few to matter, can only watch as their last protection crumbles like stale bread. The enemy has been patient, but their patience has limits. Their own supplies are running low, their soldiers are growing restless, and their commanders are under pressure to conclude this expensive operation. The time for waiting has ended. The time for action has arrived. The final assault begins at dawn, not because dawn has any tactical significance, but because it's traditional. The enemy has maintained many traditions throughout this siege, perhaps as a way of preserving their own humanity while systematically destroying yours. Their war horns sound across the landscape like the trumpets of Judgment Day, and their battle cries echo off the stone walls like the voices of demons. But there's something almost anticlimactic about the actual breach. The walls don't explode in a shower of stone and mortar. They simply give way. Like a dam that's been holding back water for too long, they surrender to the inevitable with a sound like the world sighing. One moment there's a barrier between you and the enemy. The next moment there's a gap wide enough for an army to march through. The defenders who remain are too weak to offer meaningful resistance. They raise their weapons with arms that shake from malnutrition. They shout battle cries with voices hoarse from months of breathing smoke and despair, but their efforts are more symbolic than effective. They're fighting not because they believe they can win, but because fighting is what defenders do, even when defense has become impossible. The enemy soldiers who pour through the breach are a stark contrast to the skeletal figures they're attacking. They're well-fed, well-armed, and well-rested. Their armor gleams in the morning sun. Their weapons are sharp and ready. Their faces show the confidence of men who know they're about to claim a victory that's been months in the making. They move with the purposeful efficiency of professionals completing a job. But even they seem shocked by what they find inside the city. These are hardened warriors who have seen the aftermath of many sieges, but the conditions inside your city are extreme even by medieval standards. The streets are littered with bodies in various stages of decomposition. The surviving population consists of walking skeletons who stare at the invaders with the blank eyes of people who have moved beyond fear into a realm of pure exhaustion. The massacre that follows is both brutal and brief. The enemy soldiers have been promised the right to loot and pillage, and they're eager to claim their rewards after months of patient siege work. But there's little left to loot and few people left to kill. The siege has done most of their work for them, leaving behind a city that's already more dead than alive. Some of the survivors try to run, but malnutrition has left them too weak to move quickly. They stumble through the streets like drunks, their legs unable to support their emaciated bodies, their lungs unable to provide the oxygen needed for sustained effort. The enemy soldiers catch them easily, dispatching them with the casual efficiency of farmers slaughtering livestock. Others try to hide, crawling into cellars and attics and abandoned buildings, hoping to escape notice until the initial fury of conquest passes. Some succeed, at least temporarily. They huddle in their hiding places, listening to the sounds of systematic destruction, waiting for either rescue or discovery. Most will be found eventually, but a few might survive long enough to see what comes after the siege. A surprising number of survivors simply stand where they are, making no effort to run or hide or fight. They've reached a point of exhaustion so complete that they can't summon the energy to care about their fate. They watch the approaching soldiers with the detached interest of spectators at someone else's execution, curious about how it will end, but not emotionally invested in the outcome. You find yourself in this last category. When the enemy soldiers reach your building, when they kick down the door and storm inside with weapons drawn, you don't run, you don't hide, you don't fight. You simply sit on your straw pallet and wait to see what happens next. You've survived this long by adapting to circumstances beyond your control, and this is just another circumstance to adapt to. The soldier who finds you is younger than you expected, barely out of his teens, with the soft face of someone who's never missed a meal. He stares at you with a mixture of disgust and fascination, clearly struggling to process what months of siege have done to the human form. You stare back with the patience of someone who has learned to wait for everything. He raises his sword, then hesitates. Perhaps he's never killed someone so obviously close to death already. Perhaps he's wondering if there's any point in hastening an end that's clearly imminent anyway. Perhaps he's simply trying to decide if what he's looking at still qualifies as human enough to murder. The moment stretches between you like a bridge across an abyss. You could speak, could plead for mercy, or curse him for his cruelty, but words seem inadequate to the situation. What is there to say? That you want to live? That you're afraid to die? That you've already died a dozen times over the past 3 months, and this would just make it official? Instead, you simply nod. A small gesture that acknowledges his authority, accepts his decision, and releases him from the burden of choice. It's a gift, perhaps the last gift you'll ever give. Permission to do what he's going to do anyway. He brings the sword down quickly, professionally, without malice or pleasure. It's a clean death, cleaner than anything you've witnessed in months. There's no prolonged suffering, no gradual deterioration, no slow fade into oblivion. One moment you're alive, the next you're not. It's almost a mercy. But that's not quite the end of your story, because stories about sieges aren't really about individuals. They're about what happens to entire populations when civilization breaks down, when the social contracts that hold communities together are dissolved by necessity, when human beings are forced to choose between their humanity and their survival. The city that emerges from the siege is not the same city that entered it. The physical destruction is obvious. Buildings reduced to rubble, walls breached and broken, streets littered with the debris of war. But the psychological and social destruction runs much deeper. The survivors, the few who manage to live through both the siege and the massacre that follows, carry scars that will never heal. They've seen things that can't be unseen, done things that can't be undone, learned lessons about human nature that can't be unlearned. They know how quickly civilization can collapse, how thin the line is between order and chaos, how little it takes to reduce human beings to their most basic survival instincts. They know because they've lived it, survived it, and been forever changed by it. The enemy army, having claimed their victory, moves on to other targets. They leave behind a garrison to hold the city, but there's not much city left to hold. The population has been reduced from 15,000 to perhaps a few hundred. The buildings are mostly ruins. The infrastructure has collapsed completely. What was once a thriving urban centre has become a monument to the effectiveness of siege warfare as a tool of conquest. In time, the city might be rebuilt. New people might move in to replace those who died. New buildings might rise from the rubble of the old ones. New walls might be constructed to replace those that fell. But it will never be the same city, just as the survivors will never be the same people. The siege has ended, but its effects will ripple outward through space and time like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The survivors will carry their trauma to other places, other communities, other generations. The stories they tell, when they can bear to tell them at all, will serve as warnings about what human beings are capable of when pushed beyond their limits. And somewhere in those stories, in the collective memory of what happened during those 107 days of hell, your own small part in the tragedy will be preserved, not as a hero or a villain, but as one of thousands of ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and did whatever they had to do to survive. The siege is over. The city has fallen, the story has ended, but the lessons it teaches about human nature, about the fragility of civilization, about the price of survival, will endure long after the last stone has crumbled and the last survivor has died. Because that's what sieges really are: laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance, workshops for discovering what people become when everything they thought they knew about themselves is stripped away by necessity. And the results of those experiments, recorded in the chronicles of history, serve as reminders of both our capacity for evil and our incredible will to survive. Your siege is over, but somewhere else, in some other time and place, another siege is beginning. And the lessons learned from your suffering will help determine whether the next group of survivors emerges with their humanity intact or loses it entirely in the crucible of desperation. The walls have fallen. The city has died. But the story continues because it always continues, as long as human beings build cities and other human beings decide to tear them down. The aftermath, what we learn from hell. So there you have it. 107 days inside a medieval siege, from the first optimistic morning when relief seemed just around the corner to the final moments when the walls crumbled and the city died. It's a journey that no human being should ever have to take, but one that thousands upon thousands of people throughout history have been forced to endure. The siege we've just experienced together isn't fiction. It's not Hollywood drama or literary exaggeration. Every detail, every horror, every desperate measure we've witnessed has been documented in the historical record. The cannibalism at Ma'ara during the First Crusade, the systematic starvation of Antioch, the psychological breakdown of entire populations trapped behind walls while armies waited patiently outside for hunger to do their work. Medieval siege warfare was perhaps the most effective military strategy ever developed, not because it was particularly sophisticated or technologically advanced, but because it exploited the most basic human vulnerabilities, our need for food, water, shelter, and social connection. It turned these necessities into weapons, transforming the very things that sustain life into instruments of death. The mathematics of siege warfare were brutally simple. An army could surround a city, cut off its supply lines, and then simply wait. Time was on the attacker's side. Every day that passed made the defenders weaker, hungrier, more desperate, more likely to make mistakes or surrender. The besiegers, meanwhile, could maintain their strength with regular supply trains, rotate their troops to prevent exhaustion, and conduct their siege with the patience of farmers waiting for crops to ripen. But the true genius of medieval siege warfare wasn't military, it was psychological. The siege engines weren't just weapons, they were instruments of terror designed to break the defender's will to resist. The bombardment wasn't just about creating physical damage, it was about creating a constant state of fear and anxiety that would wear down mental resistance over time. The catapulting of severed heads, diseased corpses, and human waste wasn't just about spreading disease. It was about sending a message that the attackers were willing to abandon all civilized restraints in pursuit of victory. It was psychological warfare in its purest form, designed to convince the defenders that surrender was not just preferable to continued resistance, but essential for preserving whatever remained of their humanity, and it worked. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of cities that surrendered not because their walls had been breached or their soldiers defeated, but because their populations had been reduced to such desperate straits that continued resistance became impossible. The siege of Jerusalem in 1099, the siege of Antioch in 1097-98, the siege of Ma'ara in 1098, all of these ended not with dramatic military victories, but with the slow, inexorable triumph of hunger over hope. The human cost of these sieges was staggering. Entire populations were wiped out, not by sword or fire, but by starvation and disease. Cities that had thrived for centuries were reduced to empty ruins. Cultural and economic centers that had taken generations to build were destroyed in a matter of months. The demographic impact of medieval siege warfare was comparable to that of modern genocides, but it was achieved through patience rather than violence, through waiting rather than attacking. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval siege warfare was how it revealed the fragility of human civilization. The social contracts that hold communities together, the moral principles that guide individual behavior, the cultural institutions that preserve knowledge and values, all of these proved to be far more fragile than anyone imagined when subjected to the pressure of prolonged siege. People who had lived their entire lives as law-abiding citizens became thieves and murderers when faced with starvation. Families that had been bound together by love and loyalty turned on each other when resources became scarce. Communities that had prided themselves on their moral standards abandoned those standards entirely when survival was at stake. The transformation wasn't gradual or subtle. It was rapid, dramatic, and complete. Within weeks of the siege beginning, people were stealing food from their neighbours. Within months, they were eating their pets, their leather goods, their dead. The descent from civilization to savagery took less time than a single season, and once it began, it proved almost impossible to reverse. This isn't a judgment on the people who lived through these sieges. It's an observation about human nature under extreme stress. When faced with the choice between death and the abandonment of moral principles, most people choose survival. When forced to choose between their humanity and their lives, they choose life and hope to reclaim their humanity later. The survivors of medieval sieges, the few who lived through both the siege itself and the massacre that typically followed, carried psychological scars that never healed. They had seen the worst that human beings were capable of, both in others and in themselves. They had learned lessons about the nature of civilization, morality, and survival that no one should ever have to learn. But they also demonstrated something remarkable about human resilience. Despite everything they endured, despite everything they witnessed, despite everything they were forced to do, some of them managed to rebuild their lives, their communities, their faith in the possibility of human goodness. They proved that while civilization is fragile, it's also renewable. That while moral principles can be abandoned under extreme pressure, they can also be reclaimed when that pressure is removed. The lessons of medieval siege warfare remain relevant today, not because we're likely to face similar circumstances, but because they reveal fundamental truths about human nature that transcend historical periods. They show us how quickly social order can collapse when basic needs aren't met. They demonstrate the importance of maintaining supply chains, infrastructure, and social institutions that can withstand stress. They remind us that the civilization we take for granted is far more fragile than we like to believe. In our modern world, we've largely eliminated the threat of medieval-style sieges through technological advancement, international law, and humanitarian intervention. But we still see echoes of siege warfare in contemporary conflicts, in the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, in the use of starvation as a weapon of war, in the psychological warfare conducted through social media and propaganda. The siege of Sarajevo during the Bosnian War lasted nearly 4 years and demonstrated that the basic principles of siege warfare remain effective even in the modern era. The siege of Leningrad during World War II showed that entire populations can be subjected to conditions similar to those experienced in medieval sieges, with similar results in terms of human suffering and social breakdown. These modern examples remind us that the capacity for both cruelty and resilience that we've witnessed in our medieval siege hasn't disappeared from human nature. It's simply been suppressed by the prosperity and security that most of us take for granted. But when that prosperity and security are threatened, when basic needs become scarce, when social institutions begin to fail, the same dynamics that played out in medieval cities can emerge with frightening speed. So what can we learn from our journey through this medieval nightmare? First, that civilization is precious precisely because it's fragile. The social institutions, moral principles, and cultural values that make human life bearable are not natural or inevitable. They're artificial constructions that require constant maintenance and protection. Second, that human beings are capable of both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary resilience. The same species that can reduce its own members to cannibalism under extreme stress can also rebuild communities, preserve knowledge, and maintain hope in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Third, that the basic human needs for food, water, shelter, and security are not luxuries but necessities, and that societies that fail to provide these necessities for all their members are inherently unstable and vulnerable to collapse. And finally, that the stories of those who suffered through medieval sieges deserve to be remembered not as entertainment or historical curiosity, but as warnings about what can happen when human beings are pushed beyond their limits, and reminders of the price that ordinary people pay for the ambitions of their leaders. The next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate not just the food, but the entire system of agriculture, transportation, and commerce that brought it to your table. The next time you turn on a tap and clean water flows out, remember that access to safe drinking water is a luxury that most people throughout history could never take for granted. The next time you sleep safely in your bed, protected by laws and institutions and social contracts that most of us never think about, remember how quickly those protections can disappear when civilization comes under stress. Because somewhere in the world right now, there are people living through their own version of a medieval siege. They're making the same impossible choices, facing the same desperate circumstances, discovering the same harsh truths about human nature that we've explored together tonight. Their stories deserve to be told, their suffering deserves to be acknowledged, and their lessons deserve to be learned. The siege is over. The walls have fallen. The city has died. But the story continues, because it always continues. As long as human beings build cities and other human beings decide to tear them down. Thank you for joining me on this dark journey through one of history's most brutal forms of warfare. If you found value in this exploration of human endurance and the fragility of civilization, please consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Let me know where you're listening from and what aspects of medieval siege warfare you'd like to explore further. Until next time, sleep well in your safe, warm beds, and remember that the comfort you take for granted is a gift that countless generations before you could never have imagined. The siege is over, but the lessons remain.